On July 10, 1941, the Soviet newspaper Pravda published a small article about the Soviet bomber pilot Captain Gastello. Captain Nikolai Gastello was carrying out a combat mission. In a sky filled with enemy fire and thunder, he held his course unwavering. And then a hit, an enemy shell struck the fuel tank. Flames engulfed the aircraft. He could have saved himself, bail out, surrender, captivity, bitter, humiliating, but perhaps survivable. But Gastello chose another path. He didn't unbuckle his harness. He didn't abandon the burning plane. Hands on the controls, he steered the flaming aircraft downward, straight into a cluster of enemy tanks and fuel trucks. The fire was already upon him. It scorched his hands, blinded his eyes, but he held on, a dying pilot flying a dying plane. And then, impact. The aircraft crashed into the enemy convoy. One explosion, then another, a chain reaction of fire and thunder. The enemy fuel trucks erupted in a storm of flames. This is how his life ended. Not in a crash, not in surrender, but in an act of heroism. Remember the name, Captain Nikolai Gastello. His family lost a son, a husband, but the motherland gained a hero. Among the immortal Stalin's falcons, his deed will live forever. The man who calculated his death as a fearless strike against the enemy. Now, this small article, published not even on the front page but only on the second page of the newspaper, was destined to become one of the greatest and most successful examples of Soviet propaganda. The story of Captain Gastello's sacrifice on the altar of victory made him one of the most famous people in all of Soviet history. But in reality, Gastello's deed was nothing more than a Soviet myth. Interestingly enough, it was not the USSR's enemies who debunked the myth, but the Soviets themselves, albeit inadvertently and unintentionally. But even that could not stop the already rolling Soviet propaganda machine. Captain Nikolai Gastello, one of the most famous, if not the most famous Soviet war hero of World War II, or more precisely the Great Patriotic War, because remembering the first 2 years of World War II, when the USSR was an ally of the Nazis, is considered in bad taste in modern Russia. Gastello's feat is beautiful and majestic. On June 26, 1941, just 4 days after the German invasion of the USSR began, Captain Nikolai Gastello flew a combat mission as a part of a group of 3 bombers. But not far from the small Belarusian town of Radashkovichy, his plane was hit and caught fire. Gastello could have bailed out, but instead of saving himself, he decided to aim his burning plane at a column of enemy vehicles. Gastello blew up several dozen German vehicles and tanks, but was killed himself. A heroic death. Fiery ram. This is what Soviet propaganda called the heroic deed, for which Captain Gastello was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union on July 26, 1941. Thanks to these propaganda efforts, the name Nikolai Gastello became a household name in the Soviet Union and later became a noun. Inspired by the heroism of Gastello, the term Gastelovцы was applied to Soviet pilots who decided to sacrifice themselves and ram the enemy into the ground. During and after the war, the name Gastello became a symbol of bravery, selflessness, and readiness to sacrifice one's life for the Soviet homeland. Settlements and villages, steamboats and factories, schools and stadiums, collective farms and city streets were named after Gastello. Stories, poems, and songs have been written about him.
Как гордый сокол выше облаков, на крыльях сокола гроза летела, чтоб град стальной обрушить на врагов.
And when I say that Nikolai Gastello was the most famous military hero of the USSR, I'm not exaggerating at all. The name Gastello, and it is the name and not some general heroic pilot, every Soviet man knew from his earliest childhood, literally as soon as he learned to read. I dare to say that among communist heroes it was the third name a Soviet child learned after Vladimir Lenin and Yurii Gagarin. For example, here is the children's book A Sparklet for first graders. It is a kind of a collection of children's stories like Lama Lama Red Pajama, but with the addition of stories about Lenin. For millions of Soviet children, myself included, it was here, after the innocent stories about bunnies and kittens, that they learned for the first time about the exploits of Captain Gastello. And I'd like to emphasize that it's not just a children's book, but a book for learning to read. So here above each word in the text are accent marks, and at the end of each story is an explanation of new unknown words. For example, after reading this story about Captain Gastello, a Soviet child should have learned what self-sacrifice for the motherland is, as well as the meaning of such difficult words as pilot's yoke and aiming. I read this book as a 5-year-old, and judging by how easily I remembered and found it 40 years later when I decided to make this video, it's fair to say that no one could match the communists when it came to propaganda. But what was certainly not mentioned in my children's book or any other story about Captain Gastello was that this great feat was a complete and utter lie, which the Soviet authorities themselves knew about for several decades, but they decided not to bother their citizens with such unnecessary nonsense as historical truth. Here is the story. In 1950, the director of the Belarusian Historical Museum, Sergei Shutsky, on the occasion of the upcoming 10th anniversary of Gastello's heroic deed, proposed to immortalize the memory of the legendary pilot. But as it turned out, there was a tiny problem. The whole country knew about Gastello's feat, but no one knew exactly where it happened. This did not seem to be a big problem to the then director of the museum, so he sent a request to the commander of the Soviet Air Force, Pavel Zhigarev, asking him to clarify the location of Gastello's heroic deed. But to his great surprise, he received a reply that no one had such information. The only evidence of Gastello's fiery ram, as it turned out, was his nomination for an award, in which his regimental commander described Gastello's act of heroism based on the reports of Lieutenants Vorobyov and Rybas, who presumably flew on the mission as Gastello's wingmen. But neither of them could confirm anything now, because they had died at the very beginning of the war. Not to mention they served in a different bomber regiment, which altogether makes some researchers doubt that they ever flew in the same wing. Anyway, to this day, no one has ever directly seen their actual reports. There are also no aerial photographs of the scene. Two other witnesses who appeared in the documents, officers Redeko and Reiderman, who pointed to the site of Gastello's feat, turned out after a secondary check to be ground technicians who had no direct connection to his alleged deed. It turned out that the only proof of Gastello's heroic act was the statement in the award nomination that Captain Gastello's heroic deed is known to the whole country, and that poets and writers together with the people composed songs and battle stories about the glorious crew and its commander. And that's all. In any case, Comrade Zhigarev pointed out that Gastello's award nomination mentions the Radashkovichy district, and since it is an official document, thus it confirms the place where the alleged deed was performed. Once again, 10 years after one of the most important heroic deeds of the country, it turned out that no one really knew where the most celebrated hero of the country had died. And most importantly, no one cared about it all that time. This is to answer the famous Russian assertion about how they honor the memory of their heroes. However, the director of the museum did not despair, and in the same year, 1950, an expedition was sent to the area where Gastello supposedly died. The purpose of the expedition was to determine the time, place, and circumstances of Gastello's heroic deed and to find the remains of his plane. After some time, the alleged site of the fiery ram was found, and the existing version of Gastello's heroism was fully confirmed by local testimony. They also found out that the crew of the Gastello had been secretly buried by the locals not far from the place where the plane had crashed, 200 meters away from the highway. In general, the result of the expedition was a success, and the director of the museum offered the Belarusian department of the Communist Party to open the improvised grave of Gastello's crew in the field and solemnly rebury the pilots in the center of the town of Radashkovichi, where a monument would be erected in their honor. At this point, the director and other participants of the official reburial must have been somewhat confused by the fact that the place where the plane crashed is located 180 meters from the highway. On which, according to the legend, the German tanks were moving when Gastello rammed them. But with the 10th anniversary of the hero's deed fast approaching, this detail was apparently deemed insignificant. Therefore, the state allocated 20,000 rubles for the monument to Gastello and sent a team led by Lieutenant Colonel Kotelnikov to Radashkovichi to find and rebury the heroes. On June 26, 1951, the grave was opened and the remains of the pilots were indeed found there, as well as some of their personal belongings, but most importantly, one of the so-called death medallions was found. A small black bakelite cylinder carried by the military personnel, which contained a rolled-up paper form with the personal information of the soldier. And here it would seem that Lieutenant Colonel Kotelnikov could simply open the medallion in front of the camera and solemnly read the name Gastello, and his photo would be reproduced all over the USSR. But Kotelnikov, apparently guided by some inexplicable communist instinct, decided to send the capsule for examination. And what is interesting, he sent it not to some expert historians, nor to a higher military organization, but directly to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarus. The capsule was opened, and 6 months later a reply arrived, interestingly marked top secret, which Kotelnikov quickly understood why. The document showed that there was good news and bad news. The good news was that the capsule belonged to Sergeant Grigory Reutov, who served in the same 207th Bomber Regiment as Gastello. The bad news was that Reutov did not fly with Gastello, but was part of a different crew under the command of Captain Maslov, who flew on a mission with Gastello on June 26, 1941, but did not return from the flight and had been listed as missing in action along with his crew ever since. It's worth noting here, by the way, that under Soviet law, both Maslov and Reutov as missing persons were a priori suspected of possible treason against the motherland, which meant that all that time their families did not receive a pension or any financial support. Anyway, those who unearthed the grave of Gastello, or more precisely as it turned out Captain Maslov, were somewhat surprised and even discouraged, and they communicated their surprise and discouragement to Moscow, from whence came the order to start an investigation and find out what the Lenin is going on. Meanwhile, the remains of Maslov's crew were solemnly reburied in the center of Radashkovichi. In the meantime, the investigation determined that at the place indicated by witnesses as the site where Gastello's plane crashed, it was Maslov's plane that had actually crashed. Now the national hero and the potential traitor had exchanged places. Maslov was now found, but Gastello was missing. Moreover, the locals who were interviewed remembered that one of the Soviet planes had crashed into a nearby swamp that day, but an airman slipped onto the wing and jumped off, only to be caught by German soldiers. By the way, the fact that someone from Gastello's crew bailed out was mentioned in the regiment's documents from the very start. The remains of the plane were actually found in the swamp pointed out by the locals, where a paper note was found addressed to a certain Skarabagate, the wife of Grigory Skarabagate, a gunner of Gastello's crew, as well as a death medallion with the initials AAK of Alexei Alexandrovich Kalinin, also a member of Gastello's crew. Plus, in the same swamp, a piece of wreckage was found and clearly identified as part of Gastello's plane, a fragment of an aircraft engine bearing the serial number 873441. After digging in the swamp and gathering all the information, the investigators came to a simple conclusion. If the plane was in the swamp, then it probably did not explode along with the German fuel trucks on the road. After a little more thinking and digging in the documents, a second conclusion was made, that most likely the surviving but captured airman was none other than the supposed heroically killed pilot Gastello, because when bailing out, only the pilot could slip from the wing. The second conclusion looks somewhat unpleasant, considering how much Soviet propaganda had already done to glorify Gastello. And now it turned out that instead of a heroic figure who had died heroically, there was suddenly a man who had not rammed the Germans, had survived the crash, and had even surrendered as a prisoner of war. I personally don't see anything shameful in that, but that's probably what distinguishes me from the Soviet communists, who never admit to mistakes or refute their past decisions. Therefore, an order came from Moscow to classify the results of the investigation and to suppress the spread of unnecessary rumors. At the site in the field where Maslov's plane was found along with the grave of its crew, they quickly put up a huge monument. A monument to Gastello, of course, who else? Meanwhile, Maslov and his crew were reburied again, moved from the center of Radashkovichy to a mass grave on the outskirts, and in the center of town they put up a monument to Gastello, who else? As for the wreckage of Maslov's plane, it was sent to the Belarusian Museum and has been on display all this time with the explanation that it is the plane of you know who, Gastello, who else? Things had returned to their original state, and the legend of Captain Gastello continued to live on and grow right up to the last days of the USSR. It was only in the early 90s, when it seemed that the new Russia was abandoning all its past falsehoods, that the story was uncovered about how Maslov's heroism had been stolen from him in favor of Gastello. However, this version had serious opponents, starting with the son of Gastello himself, who pointed out the fact that the wreckage of Maslov's plane was found 200 meters away from the road and that he could not have rammed the ground vehicles. Moreover, the fact that the remains of the pilots and the plane were found indicates that there was no huge explosion attributed to the fiery ram. Otherwise, in such a case, all the remains would have been completely destroyed. Which kind of makes sense, and most likely Maslov either tried to make an emergency landing with a damaged plane, or maybe tried to perform a ramming maneuver indeed, but missed and fell off the road. Whatever the case, in 1996, by decree of President Yeltsin, Captain Maslov and his crew were awarded the title Heroes of Russia, but only with general commendation for heroism and without any mention of the ramming maneuver, which most likely was nothing more than a fiction of Soviet propaganda. Far from the first and far from the last. And the problem here is absolutely not Maslov or Gastello, who did nothing to create this myth and who died while serving their military duty. The problem is the bastard political system of Soviet or modern Russia, which was built and still exists on total lies. And sometimes, as I've mentioned in my previous videos, the lies are so stupid and primitive. Here it will be appropriate to recall another episode associated with Gastello and the concept of so-called courage by inheritance, in the sense that Gastello was inspired by the heroism of his former colleague, the commissar of the 150th Bomber Regiment, Mikhail Yuyukin. According to official Russian history, it was Yuyukin who made the world's first ground ramming in 1939 during the war at Khalkhin-Gol. But the reality is that neither the student nor the teacher did such a thing. And absolutely any person who can read Russian can check this and in 2 clicks open the log of combat operations of the 150th Bomber Regiment, where you will find that on August the 5th, the regiment indeed lost a bomber, and with it, quote, the hero, pilot, communist, regiment commissar Mikhail Yuyukin. The commander wrote a whole page listing Yuyukin's merits and achievements, but for some reason there was not a single word or mention of the fiery ram, only a meager, the burning plane fell to the ground in the enemy's territory. That's all. And 1 week later, on August 15, 1939, an article appeared in the newspaper Stalin's Falcon, vividly describing the heroic feat of Commissar Yuyukin, who, with an iron hand, turned the burning plane and directed it into the mass of the enemy cluster. This is how Soviet people learned about the heroic fiery ram. From just a fictional article. In much the same way and in nearly the same words, 2 years later, the Soviet people would now learn about Captain Gastello, who, inspired by the heroic deed of his former commissar, executed a similar fiery ram maneuver. Once again, a glorifying article presented a noble image of self-sacrifice for the motherland. There wouldn't be that many glorious articles, though, about the other 503 Soviet bomber crews who followed the fake example of Gastello and sacrificed their lives in real ramming maneuvers. During the war, Soviet propaganda worked hard to create an image of the soldier as a disposable resource. You are not a human being, you are a tool. You can fly a plane and the plane is more important than you. If the plane is on fire and it will be impossible to fix it, use yourself as a tool. Aim the plane at the enemy. You will die, no big deal, you're a tool, but you will cause damage to the enemy. The rest is meaningless, at any cost, like Gastello, like Yurii, like others who were given a propagandistic instruction, a kind of how to act program, and acted that way. Soviet kamikazes per se. This was achieved not only by imposing a program of self-destruction on the soldiers, however. Take a look, for example, at the famous Order number 270, signed by Joseph Stalin in August 1941. In essence, it forbade Soviet military personnel from surrendering as prisoners under threat of reprisals against their families and relatives. A resource must have no chance of survival. A resource must use itself to its full potential. Blow yourself up with a grenade, ram, die with the enemy, damage the enemy at any cost, or your family will go to the prison camps. The USSR was essentially the only country that, in order to achieve its military goals, took the families of its own soldiers hostage and forced them to pay the highest price for the mistakes of their leaders. Although, was it a price for the Soviet government? After all, it was only a man's life. The topic of Soviet casualties in World War II is extremely interesting. You've probably heard many times that the USSR lost 27 million people, or as some Russian officials now claim, even 42 million, which sounds crazy. I plan to explore how and why Russia tends to exaggerate Soviet casualties in one of my upcoming videos on my second channel, where I cover Russian history more broadly, beyond just aviation-related topics. And if you want to be the first to watch them, join me on my streaming service Nebula. That will also be the best way to support my work. As I'm sure you know, the environment for channels discussing history on mainstream platforms has become increasingly restrictive. These platforms often prioritize lighter content that maximizes general viewer comfort, while topics that deal with darker or more complex aspects of the past may get limited reach or visibility. But these are exactly the kinds of stories that deserve to be told, so that we can better understand the events that shaped the world. Because these platform policies aren't likely to change anytime soon, creators like myself are often faced with a tough choice: either shift towards safer, more generic content, or stick to meaningful topics but accept the risk that the videos might underperform or be demonetized. For independent creators like me, without big teams or production budgets, that choice can be incredibly difficult. It's especially challenging when the Russian history I cover is filled with disasters and tragedies that were long hidden from public view. Nebula is the perfect platform for thoughtful, exclusive content. Here, creators have the freedom to take on the important topics that often get overlooked or censored elsewhere. Nebula is a space where you can enjoy high-quality, in-depth videos that dive into these subjects without the restrictions often found on other platforms. With Nebula, you will also get early access to my videos and exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, such as the story of the ghost flight when a Soviet transport aircraft circled for hours over a city with an entirely unconscious crew, or the Soviets' wild attempts to mount gigantic guns on small fighters, or my video on the Russian art of military cheating, where the Soviet military used tricks and gimmicks to push through underdeveloped weapons. And it's not just my content. Nebula features dozens of unique projects like Red Atoms by Real Time History, Underexposure by Neo, and Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore. These projects wouldn't be possible without the support of Nebula subscribers. That's because Nebula is different. It was built and owned by creators like myself, making it the most sustainable way to support our work. When you sign up using my link in the description, I receive a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed. And that support helps us continually improve our content, and for you, it means no ads, no sponsorship interruptions, just pure, thoughtful video content. You can get access to Nebula with my link in the description, which gives you an amazing 40% off an annual subscription, bringing the cost down to just $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. Additionally, Nebula offers gift cards, making it a wonderful present for your friends, family, or even yourself. Why not? Sign up using my link to get 40% of an annual subscription and support my work. And as always, thank you so much for watching.